Welcome, I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel. Today we'll talk about the 32nd and 33rd considerations of Guido Bonatti. If you're not familiar with this project, this is something I started a few years ago, where I took the list of aphorisms, which are the 146 astrological considerations that Guido Bonatti wrote in around the year 1277 or so, and I started illustrating them. And the reason for that is that these considerations are aphorisms or astrological rules of thumb that you can use in all different kinds of scenarios and types of astrology. And I decided to start unpacking them one by one, or in some cases in groups as it made sense, and then illustrating them with cartoon animals and other things that I think audiences can use to understand these rules and really make these rules their own and incorporate them into their astrology. I also wanted to say thank you very much to my patrons. This was really my first Patreon project. This is how my Patreon got started, and I'm very happy to have restarted it again. Under Mercury retrograde, I guess what is old is new, and so I am now back working on, well, consideration 34 at the moment. That should be out in about a week's time. So only about 110 considerations to go. If you're interested in learning more about this project, I encourage you to visit patreon.com/Nina Griffin, where I talk more about it, and you can become a patron if you aren't one already to get early access and, of course, exclusive access to videos like this one, because these deep dive exclusive videos will only be available to patrons rather than the general public. All right, so what are the considerations? So right now, in the early 30s of the considerations, we're talking primarily about the effects of the malefic planets. So considerations 32 and 33 are considerations that primarily deal with what it means to have a malefic as a significator. So if a malefic planet rules an important house in a horary or electional chart, as well as a natal chart in many cases, Guido Bonatti gives you some rules of thumb as to when that malefic significator will be a problem versus when it might not be. So in case you're not sure, this is, by the way, the page that I have created. And so you can look it up on patreon.com, and you can go, and of course you can see a much larger version of that. All right, let's get started. The 32nd consideration, I'll read it out to you the way that Guido Bonatti wrote it. Sometimes I compress it or rephrase it a little bit for the purposes of the illustrations, just to fit everything on there and to make it a little bit more accessible to a modern reader. His phrasing is primarily Latinate because, of course, the book that this came from, the Book of Astronomy, was originally written in Latin, and the translation is very faithful to that kind of phrasing. So here's what he says. The 32nd consideration is that you look to see if a malefic planet were the significator of some matter, what kind of condition it had, because if it were good, it will be good concerning the matter. If, however, it were bad, it will be bad concerning the matter. Okay. Sarcinator. Sarcinator is an unknown astrological author that Guido Bonatti sometimes quotes. He said Sarcinator said something just like this in the Pentadeca. A malefic planet, when it is oriental, presumably oriental of the sun, rising before the sun, in its domicile or exaltation, and is not joined to a malefic who impedes him, is better and more dignified than a retrograde and impeded benefic. So you can see here that Bonatti is saying that if you have a malefic that rules something important in the chart that you care about, whether it's money or anything else, if it is strong enough, right, if it is dignified, it's in its own sign, or it's in exaltation, it's not afflicted by the other malefic, presumably by some kind of harsh aspect or something like that, it is considered to be better to have that as your significator than some kind of wimpy benefic who might be retrograde and debilitated perhaps by sign. So interesting comparison of benefics and malefics here. Now, in the 33rd consideration, he sort of expands on this or creates a counterpoint. And he says, the 33rd consideration is that you see whether some malefic is the significator of some matter and is joined to another malefic who impedes him, or the Lord of the Ascendant or the moon were joined to him by an evil aspect, namely by a square or opposition. I think a conjunction to a malefic would also qualify, by the way. For the malefic perfects the purpose but does not make it arrive to a good end. Rather, it will destroy it after it seemed to be arranged and is believed to be perfected. But if the malefic who impeded were lighter, so that it sought the conjunction of the significator, in other words, the malefic is applying to a significator, it will impede less than if the significator were seeking the conjunction of the malefic who impedes, so that it will be worse if the significator pushes than if it itself is pushed. So the important part here, I think, is to recognize that if you have a malefic that is a significator of a particular matter, you need to recognize whether it's afflicted by another malefic, and is it impeded by or impeding the ruler of the ascendant or the moon. In the illustration that I created, I actually used a real horary chart. It's from one of the works of Ivy Goldstein Jacobson, who was a horary astrologer in LA in the first half of the 20th century. And she has a horary here called Will I Be Repaid My Medical Expenses? Basically, it says here, Querent was injured in a car accident, and a witness promised to appear for her so the victim could obtain compensation for her doctor bill. And I show the chart, and what's interesting about this chart is that her money, or the money she's trying to obtain, is signified by a malefic. So I show how Bonatti's rules here can be used in this particular chart and how it actually turns out. All right, so that's basically it. I hope that you enjoyed this short video about the 32nd and 33rd considerations. And of course, I welcome your comments and any discussion that we're going to have.